Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. So could you tell us about the background of the secretary? When you told me what you'd based this book on, I was completely hooked.
Well, my sister and I grew up hearing my parents' stories of meeting in Moscow in the late 50s and their romance being trailed by the KGB and the bugs they prized out of the wall. And so it was part of our family fabric for as long as I can remember, really. So my father worked for the Foreign Office, and so had my mother. And growing up, we lived all over the world. We moved every couple of years. And so I always found myself as a child thinking I'm so lucky to have this interesting life because every couple of years when we'd finished, we'd go back to Britain and my father would work in London for a couple of years and I'd go to, you know, ordinary primary school or wherever. And I just look around and think, haven't these people done anything else? But so that was my background. So it's always been part of the family story. And I was always very interested in it. And I would, I mean, there were quite a few signposts along the way that made me wonder whether there was more to it. Um, but it, yes, it was. But what spurred the writing of this book is that after our parents died, my mother and father died within 4 months of each other, um, and my sister and I cleared their house, and my sister found some diaries my mother had written and she kept them for a few years and I said, oh, have you read them? And she said, well, yes, but there's not very much in them, quite honestly. It's just, and it covers when she was in The Hague and when she was in Moscow. But really, it's just sort of lists of parties she went to and people she met. And I thought, well, you know what, I would like to read them because of the signposts along the way, which we can discuss. Um, I had always been really interested in her Moscow years, and I'd read a lot about it. In fact, most of the books I had read about the British spies, the Cambridge spy ring, the traitors, the Burgess, MacLean, and Philby, in fact, had all come from her bookshelves. And she loved to discuss them. So I was kind of up to speed with a lot of the names that were in the public domain. And in fact, when I did manage to decipher the diary, I've actually got it here. I thought you'd like to see it
Oh
because
yeah, yeah.
it's really tiny. It's
Oh wow.
only that big, but it is absolutely
Oh, it's
full
crammed. Yeah,
of
yeah.
tiny writing. Um, and it's 41,000 words. I
Wow.
know because I transcribed it, and it took me nearly 3 weeks
Wow.
to um, to decipher the right. I knew her handwriting, but this is particularly tiny. And so read it, decipher it, and put it into a computer document and research the names and places.
Hmm.
And so that's where things started to get really interesting.
And you had a story, I think, in the afterword of the novel where your mother pulled a book from the shelf, a book from her bookshelf, and drew your attention to it.
Yeah, well, that would be that was one of our things. She and I, we had a very close relationship, and I think she did use me as a confidant of sorts, from my teenage years. And she used to give me books all the time. I mean, I honestly, I think it's no exaggeration to say that I became a writer because I wanted to impress her, because she loved books and she was very well read. And all the books she used to say to me, you might want to read this, it's jolly good. They were always interesting and well written and something fascinating about them. So when she was in her 80s, and she knew I'd always been interested in the Cold War intelligence period. And it was so casual, it was so typical of her. And she just went over and she pulled out this history of MI6 and said, "Well, this is a very good one, but of course it doesn't go up quite far enough. I think it stops in 1949." But she said, "It's jolly good, but of course we never talked about what we did." And for her, in if you had to know how discreet she was to know how important that that was. And so after that, I think I said to her, I'd always had my suspicions. And she said, "Yes, I know." Um, but I said, "But I didn't push it because I was really aware that I shouldn't, and there were reasons why um, things had to remain secret or discreet."
Hmm.
And so we talked a little bit about that. And then sort of every time I would go to my parents' house after that, I'd kind of open a conversation, and she would tell me a little bit, never, never anything about what she had done work-wise. No, not at all. It would always be sort of more personal things. Um, but she used to tell me that uh, she was always very proud. If I just rewind a bit, I always knew she'd been a secretary, but she used to say to me when I was growing up, "Well, I was a lot more than just a secretary." And I used to think, yeah, yeah. I mean, she probably did a bit of filing or something like that. I had no idea when I was, early teenager when she used to say that. But so she she was so she would love to tell me sometime, just things that didn't make sense out of, beyond the tiny little capsule she was letting about how she'd helped her boss draft something, and he'd got something wrong, and she would automatically correct him, and he'd be so embarrassed but always know that he could rely on her, which that doesn't sound very much, I realize. But yeah, so there was I was I mean, I think when my imagination caught fire, really, when I was a student, and went, I was at Cambridge, and I was at Trinity College, which was the centre of the Cambridge spying in the 1930s. And it there were very exciting whispers when I was there, um, that one of the tutors was the MI6 recruiter. And it I mean, it was true. Um, he died a couple of years ago, but he was a really lovely man, very kind and perceptive about the students he was tutor to, including me. Um, so when I was there, she came back on her own for Christmas, just with me in London, and my parents were living in Singapore at the time, and so my mother came back, and I said, "Oh, well, come and stay at Trinity, and it'll be fun, and you'll be able to see it better." And I think she'd only been once to have a quick look, and that was because I went up just before they went to Singapore. And so the normal thing was, if students wanted their parents to stay, you went to your tutor and you asked for um, a, a room, and it would cost about you know £2 or something, and the parents were allocated some sort of backwater first year accommodation room. Anyway, my tutor wrote me not one but two notes that I still have, very keen that we should go and collect the key from him and have take my mother and to tea with him, and which we did, and had a conversation that I'm sure went way over my head. Um, but I do remember there were two things after that. Afterwards, we got the key from him, and we went to find where her allocated room was, to find that it was this palatial suite on Great Court, that I'd never had any idea was even there. But and I just thought, wow, he's being really, really nice to her to give her this room, and or rooms. And the second was after that. My mother was very sparkly. I could just tell that, she'd had fun. And so after that, I always did think, I wonder, that seemed unusual, let's say.
So
And
these
and I did
revelations didn't come
ask,
as a surprise to you then.
sorry.
It didn't come as a surprise to you that she had this whole hidden past during the
Um,
Cold War that had
I
never been
think,
discussed.
well, I'm not sure at the time I really put two and two together, but it was only later
Hmm.
that I thought, no, that it's sort of I can understand a bit more, and so just to wheel back, so after she'd taken the book out and admitted she was MI6, um, I would press her on things, and I
Hmm.
did say to her, "Oh, that time when you came to Cambridge, I'm sure Mr. knew exactly who you were." And she just gave one of her typical answers. She said, "Well, I wouldn't be surprised." And that was, that's how it went. It could mean anything or it could mean nothing.
Hmm.
And but yeah, fascinating. And so and I got used to get various things. I mean, she said, "Oh, there were four of us who knew all the secrets in the embassy in Moscow." And I thought, I mean, seems unlikely. Maybe she meant there were four secretaries who got the secret work, which is enough. But that anyway, I don't know. But I was very excited when but I had no kind of proof of anything. But if
Hmm.
it because it had all been so um, nebulous, apart from her saying effectively I was MI6. So when I read the diary and I discovered that she used to uh, type lengthy reports for a character in the diary called Harry Rigby, I thought, okay, well, he's exactly the kind of name I need to look up, and found out that he was Professor Rigby, who was an Australian academic attached to the Foreign Office research group. I can't remember quite what they're called, but anyway, he was the they didn't call him the MI6 guy in Moscow. He was an advisor to MI6, but he was working in Moscow. And I thought, well, that's interesting, isn't it? So, so she was working, and in fact, he became a very eminent Western Sovietologist. And I've no idea what he was like as a man. So I invented a rather over the top Australian, kindly disposed, in the book as a kind of nod nod to him.
Hmm. So your mother was in based in Moscow in 1958. You said the difficulties of women making a career in the Foreign Service comes up often in the secretary. They're taken for granted. They're seen as less capable, relegated to lower level responsibilities, and expected to resign when they marry. Um, but they make excellent spies, clearly. Could you say more about the struggles of women at that time in this profession? Like, did your mother talk about that aspect of
Yeah,
it very much?
yeah. My mother was, I would say, always quite resentful that she had to give up her job on marriage. She accepted my father's proposal by telegram from London when she was still in Moscow, and I think she'd been having such a miserable time there that she accepted on the spur of the moment. And I think that the family law was, she said yes, tentatively yes, but many questions. And when she got back from London, he'd told everybody, and she found that effectively he'd put in her resignation. And she had been asked to do a really top flight job. And maybe it was the her, pretty grim experiences in Moscow that made her think, you know what, I'm just going to get married. But so she effectively married the Foreign Office anyway, and then spent 25 years as unpaid diplomatic wife, moving up, using all her intelligence and efficiency to be a fantastic diplomatic wife,
Hmm.
doing all the entertaining, the moves, dealing with two daughters. And honestly, I think there were times when my father really would not have been able to do it without her.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, she often said that she wished she'd been able to carry on working, but it just that wasn't. I think it was until 1972 women couldn't work for the Foreign Office MI6
Hmm.
if they were married. And the one thing that could rile her, strictly at home behind closed doors, was when, young diplomats from, on the fast track from Oxbridge would be quite rude or dismissive to
Hmm.
her. But of course, she could never say anything. She could just had to elegantly rise above it, because
That's
of
incredibly
course
frustrating. So
she
you're
wouldn't.
so great at bringing exotic settings to life as well, and you do a remarkable job of evoking Cold War Moscow. Have you been there before, or how much was based on your own travel impressions, and how much is research, the setting?
Um, well, it's a mixture of my parents' stories about Moscow. I did, as a child, I went there a couple of times. Um, I mean, I know people who say you can't remember it back so young. I was 5, 6, but actually, I've always been blessed with a very acute memory, and I can remember. And so I remember the high grey apartment blocks and being sat down with a Russian doll and a recording of Peter and the Wolf to listen to while the adults talked. And then, so there's that, and the terrible Aeroflot flights we used to get. Very dangerous, I discovered some of those flight. They had to be piloted by ex-military pilots because only they could handle them. Anyway, that's an aside. So I've got photographs and my own research, but a lot of it was, the things my mother told me about this incredibly oppressive atmosphere. And she always said, people on the streets, they never smiled. It was just so grim. And whether that was, obviously they're not smiling at foreigners, they can't, I'm sure. But she found the lack of privacy really demoralizing. So a lot of it is from what they would tell me,
Hmm.
and an amalgam, really.
So, and the other element that you've captured really well was the constant sense of threat hanging over everything. The feeling of always being watched, always being listened to, and the suspicion verging on paranoia of not being able to trust anyone on either side, not even your own colleagues. Everyone seems to have their own agenda. You managed to keep the tension buzzing without it ever becoming a distraction. So what's your secret there? Have you been in this kind of situation before?
No, I think I'm just over imaginative, maybe. But I mean, that does come from conversations with my parents. And, I grew up in the sort of the diplomatic compounds and things. I mean, I was a child in Peking, as it was then when the Cultural Revolution started. So I remember very well that
Hmm.
tension, even though I was a child. I remember the embassy kids, the younger ones, the older ones were all at boarding school back in America, in the UK. Um, but there was an international English speaking Catholic convent school, which we used to go. Fabulous school, very old fashioned. We were all writing in cursive script by five, and I went in the school bus one morning to see red guards on the steps of the school, and the nuns, having been their habits been taken off, and they were parading round in front, being humiliated. And we children, I mean, oldest probably about 8 or something, we all said, but we're from the British Embassy. We need to go and save the nuns. And luckily, the Chinese driver, put his foot on the accelerator, and we didn't really stop in my memory. But I still have a vivid memory of looking out of the window and seeing this. And so, and being driven back, and that was the last time we went to school. And then the tension started ratcheting up because, first of all, our cook and our armor started saying, we're frightened, we love coming to work for you, but we can't be seen to do it. And I just do remember the sort of smoke-filled room, and parents and other people, discussing what was going on, and how frightening it was. So maybe I
Hmm.
kind of draw on that.
So, do you think it was growing up in those settings gave you such a strong sense of place? Because it's a common element in each of your novels.
Yeah, I think I always, my parents always tried to ground us in the new surroundings. And, we would be excited about all the new things we could see. I mean, my parents were certainly very excited by living in Peking. They thought it was colourful and friendly, and it was beginning to open up a bit to Westerners. And the food was fabulous. Obviously, now you look back and you just think, yes, it was fabulous for the diplomatic circles, and may not have been so. so fabulous for the millions living in the countryside. So there was that, but it was, a fascinating place to be. And so, we never, all we ever traveled with were, my parents' personal effects and a few, and books and crockery and things. So we used to try to, I guess, put down stable roots for however long it was going to be by, you know, immersing ourselves and noticing the small things and
Mhm.
how different it was from England.
Hmm.
So maybe it is. Maybe it's just something that has evolved for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you must have overheard some fascinating conversations as well. As a kid sitting in the corner of a room where nobody thinks you're really listening.
Yeah, the sad thing is I can't remember exactly any of them. I just sort of remember the mood more than I can't remember any
Hmm.
uh, any exact conversations.
So you mentioned earlier that the timing of the story, the core narrative in the secretary. Some of my listeners might not know who Donald MacLean and Guy Burgess were. So could you fill them in on that aspect of the background?
Yes. So Maclean and Burgess, along with Kim Philby, were part of what was called the Cambridge spy ring of the 1930s. So they'd met in Cambridge. Um, uh, they'd it was at a time when ideologically many of the intelligentsia were leaning towards communism, really in a reaction to what was happening in Germany and Italy with fascism. Um, but the three of them, Burgess, Maclean, and Philby, all joined the British Foreign Office and worked, and MI6 as well. I mean, sometimes it seems to blur. Um, and they were work. The bottom line is that they were working for the Soviet Union, and Burgess was particularly loose cannon. He was a terrible drunk. But they were passing on secrets. Burgess did a lot of damage from Washington. Donald MacLean also sort of, I can't remember, maybe first secretary, something like that in embassies abroad. I think he was in Cairo. But anyway, they were in positions to start to pass useful information to the KGB, and they did, and they got away with it for so long because Kim Philby was sort of arch manipulator. He was the most dangerous of them all, and he got himself into positions where he could protect them and protected them for as long as he could. Interesting enough, just to digress a bit, there were several women who worked for the Foreign Office, including a woman called Jane Sisbor, who flagged up that Philby should be investigated or there was something not right about him. And because they were women, their concerns seemed to have been batted away, which, considering how deeply Philby especially allowed the KGB to penetrate the British and the American intelligence services is quite staggering.
Hmm.
Um, and Philby effectively tipped off Burgess and Maclean in 1951 that I think it was in Washington, the Americans had really started decoding things that he was sending, Burgess was sending, and the time was clearly up. The net was
Hmm.
closing in on him, and they were tipped off, and Burgess and Maclean fled to Moscow in 1951, where for the rest of the 50s, any British embassy staff were told to avoid them if they ever saw them, the Bolshoi or anything. Just do not approach. Just don't. And but Philby was still at large, and he'd been sort of rumbled because yeah, the net was closing on him, but he was such a glib liar. There's a really fascinating bit of film of when he was named by an MP in Parliament as the third man of the ring, and he gave a press conference in his mother's apartment in Kensington,
Wow.
and it was filmed as well. It's really worth watching. And the man is so suave and debonair and such a glib liar that he persuades the gathered press that he's innocent as the day is long. And a lot of them believe him. So he's never really allowed back into the Foreign Office or MI6, except his friends who believe that he can't possibly be a wrong 'un because he's one of them. He's been to Trinity, Cambridge. You know he's upstanding, and he's explained himself. And he then is goes to Beirut as a journalist for the Observer and the Economist, I think. But he's doing low level intelligence work for them.
Well, that's something I
And
want to ask you about, actually. You just said that some of their success, you attributed it to elitism, like old school networks and class conflict, people covering up for or vouching for one of their own. Could you explain that for non-British listeners who didn't grow up in the British class system? Why that would work?
yeah, well, at the time, it was considered that if you had the right connections, you'd gone to the right school, usually a private, expensive school, um, that you were establishment and you had connections with your family, so that they could vouch for you that you're absolutely okay. Um, and then you go to Cambridge and you're taught by the best minds there are. What could possibly, why would you possibly want to do anything to harm the establishment? And so there were lots of people who either refused to see the warning signs about Burgess and Maclean, and that sort of, it was the women, the slight outsiders, who were saying, "You really need to look at this guy because there's something that's not stacking up," and their concerns would be dismissed. And and when you've got Philby sort of sidelining the people, because he's on the inside and he's sidelining people who um, have been raising the red flags in the sense of not Moscow red flags, um, then it's all too easy. And there's a brilliant book by Ben McIntyre when Philby is finally unmasked. They finally can't defend him any longer. His great friend Nicholas Elliott, he was quite senior in MI6 himself, and has been station chief in Vienna and now Beirut, and had been using Philby to do some low level sort of observance intelligence. But actually, Philby was still working for the KGB. He was still really serving his Soviet masters. And eventually, Nicholas Elliott realizes he can't defend his friend any longer. And he confronts him in January of 1963. So this is 12 years almost after the first two have defected. And Ben McIntyre writes the most brilliant account of Nicholas Elliott recording the conversation with Philby and saying, "We know, just give it up." And then there's a really enigmatic episode at the end, Philby is supposed to be going to meet his wife to go to a dinner party after this encounter, and he gets on a freight ship or something and goes to Moscow. And the enigma is, did Elliot let him go?
Ah,
Um, because, I mean, for all sorts of reasons, not just because they were friends, although by that stage I should imagine he was a very big disappointment. But maybe it was easier and more realpolitik for the British to let him go quietly rather than to have the massive, we found this spy,
hmm.
and all the ramifications of that, because it's embarrassing, let's face it. They've already been telling people for years, dear boy, you've got it wrong about Kim. Um,
Ah.
so it's a really fascinating area of history and
Hmm.
misguided loyalties and betrayals.
And then it
Um,
raises the question as well, and which you capitalize on in the book, is how many more could there be? Like, if these guys could infiltrate the British services, the Americans, at such a high level, how many more are there that we don't know about? So just draws the paranoia even deeper.
it does, and it is endlessly fascinating. Funnily enough, I've just read a book that really fascinated me about Moscow, and it's The Billion-Dollar Spy by David Hoffman. And the
Hmm.
bit when it's running this guy called Tolkachev, but later on in the late 70s, early 80s, and how they have to practice in Moscow really old style tradecraft that they would have used in the 50s. And I won't go into the whole story, but it just shows that this kind of thing went on for longer than maybe people think. But was a fascinating little aside in the book about a female CIA operative called Martha Peterson, who went to Moscow and pretty much had to act as a secretary in the embassy. But her real job was as the CIA operative and helping to run this spy in Moscow. And it just showed that that was still happening. The women had to be so discreet and they were so effective because they were doing a real, actually grinding job as well as what they were being asked to do for the intelligence services. Anyway,
Yeah,
so
far better
hats off.
to far better to employ the sort of person that no everybody just overlooks, and at a time like
Yes,
that, that really takes advantage of the way that women were seen in the 50s. You know, just they're just in the background. Nobody thinks that they're capable of such things. That's the
it
perfect
is.
person to use. You've got a really good quote too from a KGB agent in your book, Zigunov. He says, "Informed and intelligent people can be persuaded easily if they want to believe. Equally, when this belief is established and they're shown the proof is wrong, the proof that it is wrong, the mind fights hard to disprove this evidence. Reason is nothing against the desire to retain the belief." So it gives a sense of why people might insist on believing somebody like Kilby despite, or Kilby, that's a singer I like, Philby, despite the glaring evidence that there's something shady about this guy. But this stubborn consistency also plagues our own social media era. Like we've retreated into not just separate political camps, but cultural camps. And everything's about my side is right and everything about their side is wrong. So can the Cold War teach us anything about this? Like how to navigate or get out of this, do you think? Or like do we need
Yeah.
some sort of detente in the form of mutually assured cultural destruction?
Well, I mean, I have to say, when I was writing that, I was thinking of present day situations. I think our problem is that we've forgotten many of the lessons of the Cold War.
Hmm.
That, actually, we do need to be careful and considered about, who is doing what and for what motives, and maybe be a little bit more cynical about the world as it is presented to us.
Hmm.
So certainly, yes, I agree that the polarization is not helping anybody's understanding of what are often, really grey areas and so much more nuanced than people want to to think. And yes, I think these are really fascinating times,
Hmm.
mainly because of that, mainly because it's the communications aspect of it
Yeah,
that it
maybe we should be
hinders.
going back and studying the Cold War. Those of us who don't remember the having grown up in it and the way information was misused, the double meanings
Yes,
behind everything, how to read between these lines. That's
exactly. Exactly. I think you can learn a lot from, women like my mother who were just endlessly discreet, but then sort of rather elegantly deflected things. Yeah, no, it is really fascinating.
so the story cuts really close to home for you. What did you find most difficult about turning the experiences of someone so close to you into fiction? Were there particular parts that you found hard to write?
Ah, that's an interesting thing. Um, for obvious reasons, probably the relationship with the man who became her husband,
Hmm.
my father. That was quite hard because I wanted to reflect a certain amount of reality, but I didn't want to I don't know, give away too many personal
Hmm.
secrets as well. And so that was a trick. That was probably the tightrope for me. The stuff about her on in the embassy and going to Vienna. She did go to Vienna, so the story actually tracks very much the events in her diary, although she was not on the trail of a potential informant. I mean, all that is pure fiction. But she did go, I mean, so all the travel elements, like the train from Helsinki and then her trip to Vienna and to the Black Sea, are all in the diary at the time she in the book they're at this it's the same time of year and the descriptions of the places, some of them are a few of them, not many. So, but those episodes, and actually the episodes in the embassy, I just let my imagination rip really because I read quite a lot of those John le Carre's that are set in embassies, so that I got made sure I got the flavour of
Hmm.
it. And I can remember as a kid going to them or going to offices, you know abroad. And so, I think I quite enjoyed putting her in that scenario and giving her a bit of an edge that maybe she might not have had in real life.
So The Secretary is not the only novel you've written that involves East-West rivalry and espionage. 300 Days of Sun is filled with intrigue in wartime Lisbon. I ended up reading the two histories that you referenced in the endnotes for that book about Lisbon's role, at that time. It's really fascinating. So, what is it about this period, the Second World War and the Cold War, that interests you so strongly?
Yeah, I think it is the intrigue, but the intrigue comes from the what my sort of I mean to say personal aspect of it is wrong because I've never been involved in any of this. It's only what I've observed and found out. But I suppose I want to I think all novels, when you're either reading them or indeed writing them, are actually an attempt to find out about things, to find out how the world works and how you fit into it. And I definitely, because of the kind of intrigue um, of my family, and there I haven't talked about this, but I have no evidence whatsoever but I've always wondered whether my father was a little bit more involved in that kind of thing than he admitted. So it's always been a kind of, can I solve the puzzle that I've been I've been trying to do with those kind of books. I'm intrigued. I want to know what kind of people do these things and why they did them and what the context was. Um, yeah, it's just a personal interest.
So my last question, in the afterword to the secretary, you say your relationship with your parents changes for the last time after they die. Their story becomes clearer from diaries and letters that had remained private during their lifetime. It becomes a family history, and on the way, it recalibrates your own. So, how did writing this book recalibrate your relationship with your mother or how you saw her?
Um, I that's a yeah. I I'd always really admired her. She was always the cool head in the family, unflappable. And but now I think I've got an even greater appreciation of everything she did. And I understood from the diary what she meant when she said Moscow was just so tough. I mean, I was so miserable a lot of the time. I also discovered in the diary that she suffered horribly from migraines, and uh, really had to drag herself through work. She, maintenance and triggered by the stress of it all. And as somebody who, and I used to suffer horribly with migraines too. And I just thought, my mother never mentioned that part of, I mean, how can you, she didn't. And I understood more about maybe why I was also, but I thought she was strong before, and now I just can't believe what she achieved and put herself through. So I think part of writing this book was really an attempt to to tell her story, because I thought it was well worth telling. And well, others will agree or disagree. I feel pleased that I've I've managed to convey something of what a very special person she was.
It's a hell of a good read. And I think that's a fitting note to end on. Thank you for your time today, Deborah. I love the vivid sense of place you create in your novels, and it's great to finally sit down with you and talk about it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed chatting.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.